High in the hills of what is now Nagaland, terraced fields climb a ridge toward a village called Khonoma. Today it's quiet, known for conservation and carved stone gateways marked with the horns of myth and cattle. But in 1879, Khonoma became the site of the last organized war the Naga people ever fought against an outside power, and it handed the British Empire one of its most humiliating defeats on the entire northeast frontier. The Angami Naga, who lived across these central hills, were known even by neighboring tribes as formidable warriors. Villages were organized into clan groups called kells and built for war. Stone walls, narrow gates, terraces that gave defenders a commanding view of anyone approaching. Warriors fought with the dao, a heavy single-edged blade, and lined approach trails with sharpened bamboo stakes long before any attacker came within spear range. Khonoma had faced the British before. In 1850, a British force burned the village to avenge an earlier killing, then stayed 6 months. The memory of that fire never really left. By 1878, the British had shifted their regional headquarters to Kohima, right in the heart of Angami territory. This wasn't a sudden move. It was the latest step in decades of slow colonial expansion, pushing up from the tea plantations of the Assam Valley. Part of a broader pattern across British India's frontier regions. Unadministered hill tracts were treated as a problem to eventually be resolved, one way or another. The occupation of Kohima was peaceful, but tension sat just beneath the surface. Khonoma, more than any other village, resisted quietly, and its leaders had begun acquiring firearms. The British political officer at Kohima, Guybon Damant, heard the reports and decided the situation needed a direct response. On October 13, 1879, he set out for Khonoma with an escort of 20 soldiers and 65 frontier police, a serious force for what was framed as a routine visit. It was not enough. As Damant's party approached the village, Naga warriors, using terrain and fortifications built over generations, opened fire from concealed positions. Damant was shot and killed almost immediately. A volley tore into the rest of his escort, who broke and fled back down the hill, pursued and scattered as they tried to reach Kohima. 10 soldiers and 25 police constables were killed outright, with many more wounded. It was a catastrophic loss for a colonial power that depended on the appearance of overwhelming, inevitable strength. Soldiers fleeing that ambush spent hours moving through unfamiliar, hostile terrain, unsure whether the next ridge concealed more warriors or whether Kohima itself would still be standing when they arrived. Word reached Kohima fast, and fear followed close behind. Within days, an estimated 6,000 warriors from 13 villages moved to besiege the British stockade itself. For 11 days, the garrison held on, cut off, running short of food and water, while outside the walls thousands of fighters who knew this terrain intimately waited them out. Relief finally came when Colonel Johnstone, the British political agent for neighboring Manipur, marched a column north and broke the siege after nearly 2 weeks of encirclement. The garrison survived, but the crisis was far from over. A single village, allied with its neighbors, had killed a senior British officer, destroyed most of his escort, and nearly starved out a regional headquarters. In the entire history of British expansion across India, defeats on this scale, inflicted without artillery or a standing army, were almost unheard of. Colonial authorities in Calcutta could not simply let this stand. What followed was no longer treated as routine frontier policing. Multiple infantry regiments, including sepoys recruited from across the subcontinent, were mobilized, supply lines built across brutal terrain, and a full punitive campaign prepared, one that would bring more soldiers and more force to these hills than they had ever seen before. Khonoma had won the opening battle of this war. It had no way of knowing what was coming next. On November 22, 1879, Brigadier General Nation led the main assault on Khonoma. This time, the advantage in numbers and firepower belonged entirely to the attackers. British troops fought through the village's stone gateways and terraced defenses, and once inside, they burned it to the ground. Granaries, homes, and cattle were destroyed along with it, a deliberate campaign meant to make resistance unbearable for the whole community, not just the fighters who had ambushed Damant. Several neighboring villages that had joined the uprising were attacked and destroyed the same way. But when British troops entered Khonoma, they found it already deserted. The defenders hadn't stayed to be burned along with their homes. They had withdrawn to a fortified position high on the slopes of Mount Japfu, a stronghold known as the Chaka Fort, sitting at roughly 8,500 feet. That altitude alone made a direct assault a brutal and risky proposition, and British commanders, still remembering exactly what had happened to Damant's escort, chose not to repeat that mistake. Instead of storming the fort, they blockaded it, settling in to starve the defenders out rather than fight them on ground built entirely to their advantage. The siege dragged on through the winter. At that altitude, winter meant real cold, real hunger, and a slow, grinding depletion of supplies for everyone sheltering inside. British troops, too, faced brutal conditions maintaining a blockade this far from any real supply base. Exposed to the same cold and the same difficulty, simply keeping men fed and equipped at that height. Neither side could force a quick end. The defenders had the terrain and the will to hold on. But a mountain fortress, however well built, cannot grow its own food forever. And every week that passed narrowed their options in ways courage alone couldn't fix. On March 27, 1880, the defenders at the Chaka Fort finally submitted. 5 months after Damant's death, organized Naga military resistance to British rule came to an end. The peace agreement that followed is remembered today as Vitho, still marked with a traditional stone-pulling ceremony at Mazoma village, often timed with Nagaland's Hornbill Festival. The terms were sweeping. Villages had to surrender their firearms and rebuild without fortifications, stripping away the exact advantages that had made Khonoma so hard to defeat. A household tax was imposed. Villages had to elect headmen the British could deal with directly and provide labor when called on. Communities tied to the Siege of Khonoma faced extra fines on top of everything else. It wasn't just a military defeat. It was a restructuring of how these communities were allowed to govern themselves at all, trading generations of clan-based independence for a system colonial administrators could read, predict, and control. And yet, in the century that followed, the Battle of Khonoma became something else entirely, a founding story. Naga political movements would later point to it as proof that, in their words, no outside power had ever truly conquered the Naga people except the British, and only from 1879 until independence in 1947. Khonoma itself was the birthplace of Angami Fizo, born decades after the fires of 1879, in a village where the memory of that war would still have been living oral history. Fizo went on to lead the Naga National Council and the broader movement for Naga self-determination through much of the 20th century, a struggle whose roots trace directly back to the same hillside his ancestors had once defended. Today, Khonoma is known for something completely different. It's one of India's pioneering green villages, having banned hunting and logging to protect a rare pheasant called the Blyth's tragapan. The old stone gateways still stand. Alder trees, planted for generations to enrich terrace soil, still line the fields. The terraces still climb the same slopes Damant's party once walked, unknowingly toward one of the most consequential ambushes in the history of British colonial expansion. It's not a simple story. It's not just resistance crushed by empire, and it's not just order restored to a violent frontier. It's two systems, an ancient network of self-governing hill villages and an expanding colonial state, colliding over one basic question: who had the right to govern these hills? That question was settled militarily at the Chaka Fort in 1880. Whether it was ever really settled at all is still, in many ways, an open one that a small, quiet village on a ridge in Nagaland has never entirely stopped being asked.
Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.